Welcome to the introductory class on the progressive era, which is going to complement what is being done in the classroom and add to it as well, I hope. This introductory class will cover three major historical disputes that continue to occupy historians. And as always, historians give different answers to these questions, and those answers are constantly being revised over time. Who were the progressives? That is, where did they come from? What social or economic class were they from? Were they from a particular ethnic or religious background? Their goals. Did they share similar goals? If so, how could those goals be summarized and categorized? And finally, and I alluded to this when I talked about the populist movement, what makes the progressives something different, a new type of reform movement, if anything? Or are they actually just heirs in a continuous tradition dating back to the 19th century, whether the social reformers of the Gilded Age or the social and economic protest movements such as the populists? So first of all, who were they? One of the conventional accounts, and if you actually opened up your textbook and read about it, and I don't think I assigned those pages, you would probably find the following categories being listed as far as the progressive movement. They came from overwhelmingly urban backgrounds. They were middle class. They were professionals, that is, doctors and lawyers, among other professions. White-collar workers, people who worked in the growing sized office places of the early 20th century, and that they were generally Protestant, in fact, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The reality is, as historians have examined the movement and the individuals who made up the movement, more specifically, all of these categories break down. They were not necessarily urban. In fact, many of them came from Midwestern, relatively small cities or large town environments. They were not necessarily middle class. Many of them were people who were of upper class origin. My own opinion in the last two categories are somewhat more accurate. I think that there was a disproportionate number of progressives who came from professional backgrounds, white-collar backgrounds. I didn't mention in the previous slide, but I should add into the professional background, people who were part of the education establishments, which were growing rapidly during this time, whether we're talking about college professors, other academics, people who were teaching in the secondary schools. There were also a disproportionate number of Protestants, but then again, the overwhelming part of the American population continued to be Protestant. What I'd like to point out for this final religious category is that one will find large numbers of Jews, that is out of proportion to their numbers within the population, who were particularly notable in the progressive movement. In fact, the person who, in effect, coined the term progressive is somebody who was of Jewish background, and you'll be coming across in this slideshow a number of other major Jewish figures within the progressive movement. To summarize, it's not all that easy to categorize who was a progressive, who was not a progressive. They came from disparate backgrounds, and the movement itself, as you'll see with the next slide, was disparate not just in terms of backgrounds but goals as well. Certainly the one thing on which almost anybody who called him or herself a progressive could agree on, as well as their enemies, is that they were trying to ameliorate, I'll define it, improve, solve the social question. That is to, as you'll see in a later slide, address the problems of poverty, income inequality, slum conditions, and the disproportionate power of great wealth that had accumulated in this country. But how to do that? How to ameliorate the social question? Progressives did not agree. Somebody who called himself a progressive might call for very much large amounts of government regulation to control the economy, or if not to own private wealth, to take over private wealth, to at least have large-scale regulation of private wealth, interference in the economic system. On the other hand, there were very significant progressives. I'll just throw out one name that everybody will have heard of, President Woodrow Wilson, who believed in the benefits of small government. He didn't forsake the notion that government needed to address social problems and economic problems as well as political problems, but in his ideal world, government would look on as a kind of benign supervisor and umpire and only step in under the most extreme conditions to redress problems and then step back again and allow the free economy, free society to self-regulate. So once again, here too, there's not a clear answer as to what relationship the progressives have to the power of government and the power of government within the free economy and free society. But the progressives are a very special, unique movement in American history. When they appeared, and this is something that was true of progressives, whatever their solutions to problems were, or how they analyzed problems, or where they came from, what their background was. Basically, all progressives were modernizers. They were people who, unique in American history up until that time, were comfortable with and in fact celebrated urban and industrial society. We really haven't gone into the agrarian myth very much this year, something that dates back to the beginning of our republic's history, and certainly is notably seen with figures like Thomas Jefferson, and certainly again with William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement. Americans, even as America was becoming more urban and more industrial in the 19th century, and had achieved that condition by the 20th century, Americans continued to look back to rural society, agriculture, as being the most ideal form of life, the most ideal form of existence. The progressives didn't agree with that. The progressives celebrated the industrial might of the country. They celebrated factories and manufacturing. They celebrated the assembly line. They celebrated the urban environment. They didn't look upon the city as a den of iniquity. And that was something that had not really appeared in American history in a widespread movement up until this point in the late 19th and early 20th century. As I said in the earlier slide, whether they believed in ongoing government regulation, large-scale government or not, they certainly accepted an important role for all levels of government, not just local, but state, and most importantly, the federal government, as a means of solving social, economic, and political problems. Progressives also embraced science and scientific methodology. Practically every single progressive believed that science and reason was capable of analyzing and developing solutions to any problem faced by the human race, and that as long as one adopted a scientific approach, all social, economic, and political problems could be solved or come close to being solved, which actually gets to the last distinguishing feature of the progressive movement, a belief in human perfectibility. And these last 2 points, the scientific approach and the belief in human perfectibility, are really at odds with an earlier religious reform tradition. Yes, one will find in the 19th century in the United States of America religious belief in perfectionism, but ultimately religious reformers believed that the human race was sinful and that the only way to solve one's problems was by embracing Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ could, through your recognition, through your embrace, save you from your inevitable sins. The religious approach, unlike the progressive approach, was largely an individual approach. Each individual had to embrace Jesus Christ. The progressives believed that organization, groups of people, could attack problems and then through government solve these problems. In that respect, unlike the religious reform movements of the 19th century and earlier centuries, the progressive movement was really an extraordinarily optimistic movement. So what were the problems that gave rise to the progressive movement? Well, first of all, the Gilded Age, and you've seen the classes, you've looked at the crash courses on this. The Gilded Age had led America to become the world's preeminent industrial and economic power. And as a consequence of that, the United States had also witnessed the accumulation of vast concentrated wealth. Figures like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, among others, had become not just the richest men in the world by far, but the richest men that the world had ever seen. And that concentrated wealth doesn't just mean that there are people who have a lot of wealth. It means that most wealth is concentrated in the hands of small numbers of people. And that means, as a flip side, that there were huge numbers of people who had little or no wealth. And that meant that America, for the first time in its history, witnessed the rise and the growth of a huge class of extraordinarily impoverished people living in dense urban slums under conditions of terrible, terrible grinding poverty, something which America thought it could escape from, that it would never, ever actually experience. In fact, back in the early 19th century and late 18th century, figures like Thomas Jefferson, among others, Andrew Jackson somewhat later in the 1820s and 1830s, had celebrated the fact that America had managed to avoid the terrible grinding poverty and slums that seemed to beset almost every single European country. These parallel phenomena, concentrated wealth, huge, impoverished, slum living population, meant that there was diminished opportunity. No longer could Americans trust in the American dream that hard work, discipline, good education would mean that anybody could become a self-made man. Increasingly, the growth of trusts and monopolies convinced many Americans that there was really no way out of lower class background, impoverishment, extremely disturbed conditions. And that rising hopelessness and increased poverty gave rise to social unrest on a scale never before seen in America. Not just labor unions, but radical political movements, chiefly associated with socialism and anarchism, began to grow in size to a point that America, and I think I may have mentioned this in one of the earlier classes, that America experienced labor strife, that is widespread strikes, violence associated with these strikes, radical political movements, that was far greater than anything known in Europe. And once again, that was a slap in the face of the American self-image of American exceptionalism. America thought that we could avoid, that we could escape from the radical movements associated with European history, the revolutionary movements and urban rioting associated with European history. And now these seem to have arrived in America and threatened to unseat the stability that Americans felt we were inevitably going to experience. Increasingly, it seemed as if radicalism and revolution had now arrived on our shores and was going to destroy the American political system. In fact, don't forget, if you know this, otherwise I'm telling you, that President McKinley was himself shot by an anarchist and died as a result of his wounds, to be succeeded by his Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. Further problems that the progressives saw rising from the growth of industry, the accumulation of wealth, were the dangerous working conditions which only fed the radicalism. The grinding poverty was bad enough, but long, grueling working hours in the factories that were rife with accidents, huge numbers of deaths as a result of industrial accidents, were one problem. The other problem was one that was faced by people who weren't necessarily working in those factories. The average member of the population who frequently was consuming or using products that could be deadly to their health. And the most notable examples of that were quack medicines and dangerous contaminated food supplies. Lastly, the progressives felt none of these problems could be effectively attacked because the huge concentrated wealth frequently controlled governments, either directly through bribes or indirectly through campaign donations. Progressives therefore dreamed of reforming the corrupted governments that they saw existing in America during this time period. You were asked to look at this political cartoon, and this is a cartoon that really expresses that concern, that last concern of corrupted government. If you were to look over here, what you see are people sitting in the Senate of the United States of America. But if you look carefully at the words, it said, this is the Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. In other words, a play on the words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, government by the people, for the people, of the people, and for the people. Over here is the entranceway for the monopolists, and you could see them walking in. The Nail Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, which refers in that case to the Rockefellers, the Iron Trust. And obviously the size of the figures, they're huge, they're gross, they're big fat stomachs, and the fact that they loom over these tinier figures suggests pretty blatantly who's in control. It's the trust, the moneyed interests that control the government of the United States and prevent any effective reform from being adopted in the Senate and the House of Representatives by the government of the United States, as well as the local state governments. Can you guess the point of view of the cartoonist? Is he for the trusts or is he against the trusts? This cartoon is about local corruption. The figure here is Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was in control of Tammany Hall, which was the political machine, as it was called, that controlled New York City well into the 20th century. And here's Boss Tweed leaning on the ballot box. He would bribe people to vote for the people whom he wanted. He would give them gifts. Poor people would be given Thanksgiving turkeys, promises of help, such as jobs, and one of their slogans was, it's a patriotic duty to vote and vote often. And so by stuffing the ballot box, they could elect the people whom they wanted, and those people would then do their bidding. They would sell contracts to figures, and part of the money that they would make, the government would make by selling those contracts, would then be kicked back to the machine. And Boss Tweed would then distribute the money that he could gain, and in that way continue to count on support. They're called machines because the ballot box is kind of like the ballots of the raw material that produce the money that then produce the power. I'm not going to go over in any sort of detail the specific sorts of reforms that were proposed or adopted by the progressive movement. I've grouped them together into different categories, and will briefly, at least I'll try to be brief, mention what some of these things are. So I'm taking the political reforms first, actually. The belief of the progressives that until they could reform government and remove the corruption that dominated government, nothing else could successfully be solved. And in order to do that, the progressives proposed something known as municipal socialism. Municipal socialism is essentially the idea that necessary services like electricity or water supply, gas supply, the running of transportation, whether we're talking about trolleys and trams or buses or subways, should be something that was not done by private companies in competition, but that the government would sell the rights or directly run these particular utilities. And that way they could make sure that the utilities were well run, efficiently run, and that there wouldn't be unnecessary competition. There's a term that's actually used for some of these types of municipal monopolies that were established. They're called natural monopolies. Most economists would argue that some types of things really don't work if you have competition, that it doesn't really work to have multiple electrical lines running along the same streets to the same apartment buildings. much better to have a single company supplying the electricity, that you can't really have a natural competition for subway lines. You can only really have a particular subway line running on any particular or under any particular street. So municipal socialism sought to create urban monopolies that would provide the necessary services at an affordable price to people. These items, the direct primary, the referendum, the initiative, the recall, these items were means of trying to open up the political system to direct democracy. Instead of having bosses control the selection of candidates to run for office, the direct primary proposed to have the registered voter select candidates to run for office. Referendum and initiative gave voters the direct right to adopt legislation or to force their legislatures and legislators to vote on legislation. The recall gave voters the right to fire an elected official in between elections instead of having to wait 2 years or 4 years between elections to fire that official. Lastly, the 17th Amendment, which was obviously adopted under the Constitution, gave the election of senators over to the voter. Ever since the 17th Amendment was passed, senators were no longer selected by supposedly corrupted state legislatures. The voter himself, or eventually, once women got the vote, herself, were able to elect the senators. These ideas seem to create more democracy, but the reality is that many of these, like the primary, the referendum, and the initiative and recall, are items which actually give more power to people who are politically active and politically aware. Often very, very busy, hardworking people, working long hours, not necessarily literate, not necessarily being that attentive to elections and politics. Often people like that did not actually participate in primaries, referendums, initiatives, and recalls in states which adopted those procedures, and not that many states did. So that meant that actually these items, these reforms, gave increasing power to the literate, educated, politically aware, and politically active citizen. And that meant actually that instead of democracy being expanded and voter participation being expanded, increasingly politics was more and more tended to be controlled by a smaller group of politically aware citizens. And side by side with this, I'm going to mention voter restrictions. Because the progressives actually passed a number of laws, or they tried to pass in some cases, a number of laws that would have brought literacy tests to voting registration, that the secret ballot was something proposed. I've mentioned this in an earlier class. The secret ballot was proposed by progressives in order to actually make it harder for illiterate, uneducated people to vote. Poll restrictions so that people could not necessarily lobby, advise, campaign, electioneer anywhere near polling places, which made it harder for people to necessarily know whom they should be voting for. These were things that the progressives proposed as well, and they explicitly said in many cases that this would remove power from poor, immigrant, illiterate, corrupt immigrant classes. Here I'm going to go very, very rapidly. Basically, the progressives proposed a series of laws, and these named them in the chronological order that they were passed, that attacked the power of the trusts. The trusts were huge monopolies, special forms of business organization, and a series of laws would make it possible to break up trusts. I'll be getting more into that when we get to the Theodore Roosevelt classes and Woodrow Wilson classes. To break up trusts, or in the cases of the other laws, to force monopolies in trusts, particularly the railroad industry, to open up their books and to demonstrate that they were not overcharging or taking bribes or something called kickbacks, where big businesses would sometimes, in return for giving their business to railroad companies, there would be a kickback sometimes that would be provided to some of those businesses. So these laws made it more difficult for monopolies to engage in these sorts of practices. Some of these consumer and workplace laws are very, very, very famous. The first two, probably the most famous, some of you have probably heard of The Jungle. A book that was written by Upton Sinclair, which exposed the conditions in the meatpacking industry. Terrible, abysmal, filthy, unhealthy conditions. And that meant that people were eating adulterated, contaminated foods. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act provided for federal government regulation of these industries, providing for safer food supplies, safer drug supply, safer meat supply. In the case of the anthracite coal strike, the government under Teddy Roosevelt for the first time, instead of interceding in a strike on the side of the owners of an industry, in the case of the anthracite coal strike, Theodore Roosevelt basically forced the owners of the coal mines, anthracite is a form of coal, he forced the coal mine owners to provide recognition of unions, shorter working hours, higher wages. It's the first time the federal government, one of the first times the state government, actually interfered in a labor management dispute on the side of labor unions. And the Keating-Owen Act has to do with working conditions and child labor. The 16th Amendment is a notable economic reform because it amended the Constitution to make it clear that the federal government had the right to collect an income tax. And shortly after the 16th Amendment was adopted, ratified, an income tax for the second time in our nation's history was enacted and carried out. The National Resource Protection was based on the progressive notion that private competition would inevitably lead to an abuse and a depletion of our resources, that you needed a scientific management of resources. There's that notion of science, to figure out how much resources did we actually have, how much were they being depleted, how much could they be renewed? And on the basis of those investigations, resources could be regulated, they could be managed to make sure that future generations would have those resources available to them. Progressives felt that tariffs provided an unequal benefits to industries that certainly, for the most part, no longer needed these benefits. And the progressives believed that it also needed to have an even playing field, that government shouldn't be in the business of picking which industries had tariff benefits and which ones didn't, not just industries, but other sectors of the economy. Generally, progressives believed in lowering tariffs to a point where mostly the free market would operate, and prices, of course, would be lowered as well. The Federal Reserve Act finally undid I was almost about to say, in fact, I am about to say it, the crime of Andrew Jackson, who destroyed the National Bank and destroyed the national banking system. During the second half of the 19th century, the United States, I've mentioned this in previous classes, had huge numbers of financial crashes, banking collapses, consequent depressions. There was one terrible one in 1907 as well. And there was a growing call for the creation of a national banking system, some sort of a national banking system that could moderate as well as reduce the severity of financial collapses. And most historians, not all, but most historians, as well as myself, would agree that the Federal Reserve System that was created has worked pretty effectively. I haven't talked yet about one of the most notable features of progressivism, although again I've sort of side-referenced it. And that is, how did the progressives move from ideas to implementation? How did they manage to agitate, successfully or not, for the types of reforms that they were calling for? And part of that answer is that there was a rise of mass media during this time period. Industrial and technological changes led to the growth of mass newspaper and magazine production. The enormous literacy that the United States had during this time period meant that there was a huge number of consumers eager to read the material that could be produced through mass production. And a number of magazines, and to some extent newspapers, arose during the post-Civil War period that were very, very instrumental in calling for reforms. And this is most associated with the muckraker movement, which was actually a nasty term that was coined to accuse the reformers of raking the muck, of bringing up filth and dirt for the light of day. But the term ultimately became a term of admiration. Muckrakers became celebrated for exposing problems in our society, and therefore, by exposing these problems, creating agitation, popular calls for reform. The late 19th and early 20th century also witnessed a rise of interest groups, professional as well as business and other organizations that formed sometimes over specific issues like natural resource regulation and protection. Sometimes a particular business sector would have its own interest group. Doctors formed the AMA, the lawyers formed the ABA, and these interest groups would often agitate through lobbying with politicians for laws to be adopted, sometimes reform, sometimes laws protecting their own more narrow interests. And the fact that so much politics was now being carried out by the muckrakers, the magazines, the mass media, the interest groups, to a certain extent also contributed to the depoliticization that I alluded to before. The progressive era witnessed a sharp decline in the numbers of people who were voting, and to this day historians are still trying to figure out what contributed to that decline. I am suggesting, in keeping with one answer given by historians, that politics began to move towards other means of expressing itself. Interest groups, muckrakers, smaller groups of interested citizens voting, and other citizens being content with letting the elites or letting the politically active citizens or the interest groups who may or may not have represented them, they were content in letting them take the lead in politics. The progressive era belief in the value of science and the need that you needed to be educated, knowledgeable, trained, an expert also contributed to the depoliticization. Increasingly, many political reforms, many suggestions for improving life began to come out of scientific and academic studies. And in Washington, the governor of Washington, who ultimately is going to become a senator, the progressive Robert La Follette, let's write that. La Follette. Better check those L's. I'm not so sure. La Follette proposed a Wisconsin idea in which the government would provide public support for the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Wisconsin's trained experts and academics would provide advice and recommendations to government. And increasingly, much of government began to rely on commissions instead of elected officials to regulate society, to propose solutions. The last point in this introductory class that I want to cover is this notion of perfectionism, the belief that the human mind, human beings, were capable of analyzing, understanding, and suggesting solutions to nearly, maybe even all human problems. And that's associated with the notion of pragmatism, that human beings were capable of understanding their environment, and through that understanding of the environment, develop ideas which could improve their lives, pragmatic reforms. And among the most important figures associated with this, Louis Brandeis, who's associated with legal reforms and a movement known as legal pragmatism, Brandeis believed that we should not be governed by the notion that the Constitution of the United States represents some sort of a lasting, permanent, perfect idea of how to conduct ourselves. Rather, Brandeis suggested that the Constitution was a living document and that each generation had to determine how to understand the language of the Constitution by analyzing its problems scientifically, developing solutions, and figuring out how the language of the Constitution would permit us to adopt those solutions. William James, who's associated with the developments within psychology, was also a psychological pragmatist. James believed that our ideas are not some sort of a permanent thing that we're born with. They're not a permanent, unchanging, perfect thing that we're born with. Rather, human beings develop their ideas by interacting with the environment, and on the basis of that interaction, they develop a pragmatic set of ideas that enable them to respond effectively to meet the challenges of that environment. Margaret Sanger didn't think that women were destined through their biology to just simply experience inevitable childbirth. She believed that we could create scientific solutions that would allow us to make choices about when, at what pace, maybe not at all, to have children. And Franz Boas, the sociologist, also adopted the notion of pragmatism. An anthropologist and sociologist, he attacked racism within the anthropology and sociology profession. He claimed that every human society develops cultural beliefs, institutions that are based upon a pragmatic response to their environment, and that no human society is implicitly better than any other human society. I mentioned before the role of Jews in the progressive movement. Louis Brandeis and Franz Boas were both of Jewish background. And that's the introduction to progressivism. We'll be looking at specific presidents and how they attacked the problems of society.